The Central Intelligence Agency, often known simply as the CIA, is a significant part of the United States government. It was officially established in 1947, right after the turmoil of the Second World War had reshaped the global landscape. The primary stated purpose of the CIA is to collect, analyze, and evaluate intelligence information from foreign countries. This information is meant to help American leaders make informed decisions about national security and foreign policy. The CIA gathers its data through various means, including human sources, technical interception, and open-source analysis, all aimed at understanding potential threats and opportunities for the United States around the globe. Beyond gathering information, the CIA has another, more controversial role: conducting covert actions. These are secret operations designed to influence political, economic, or military conditions abroad, in situations where the United States does not want its involvement to be publicly known. Covert actions can range from spreading propaganda to supporting friendly political groups, or even working to undermine or overthrow governments perceived as hostile to American interests. These missions are planned and executed in deep secrecy, often without the full knowledge of the American public or even many members of Congress, making them a subject of intense debate. The reasons for conducting operations in secret are varied and complex from the perspective of those who authorize them. Governments often believe that open intervention would be too risky, potentially leading to wider conflicts or diplomatic crises. Secrecy allows them to pursue their objectives without immediate accountability or the complications of public debate. It can be seen as a way to achieve national goals with supposedly less cost in terms of lives and resources than overt military action. The idea is to subtly shape events from behind the scenes, nudging history in a direction favorable to American interests, without leaving clear footprints of direct involvement. However, the practice of one nation secretly interfering in the internal affairs of another is fraught with ethical and practical problems. Such actions, even when undertaken without firing a bullet in open combat, can have devastating and long-lasting consequences for the target countries. They can destabilize regions, undermine democratically elected leaders, and sow seeds of resentment that can last for generations. This essay will delve into how the CIA carried out some of its most famous government changes, focusing on the methods used, the reasons given, and the profound impacts these secret operations had on the nations involved and on America's place in the world. After the Second World War concluded in 1945, the world did not find lasting peace. Instead, a new kind of global struggle emerged, known as the Cold War. This was primarily a conflict between the two remaining superpowers, the United States and the Soviet Union. These two nations had vastly different ideas about how societies should be organized and governed. The United States championed capitalism, democracy, and individual freedoms, at least in its rhetoric. The Soviet Union, on the other hand, promoted communism, a system where the state controlled the economy and a single party held all political power. This ideological clash set the stage for decades of tension. The Cold War was not a direct, large-scale shooting war between the USA and the USSR, which is why it's called cold. However, it was a period of intense rivalry, mistrust, and competition for influence that played out across the globe. Both superpowers built up massive arsenals of nuclear weapons, creating a constant fear of catastrophic annihilation. They competed for allies, supported opposing sides in regional conflicts, known as proxy wars, and engaged in extensive espionage and propaganda campaigns against each other. Every corner of the world, from Europe to Asia, Africa to Latin America, became a potential arena for this superpower contest. For the United States, the spread of communism was viewed as a grave threat to its way of life and its global power. This fear, often referred to as the Red Scare, permeated American society and politics. There was a genuine concern, amplified by political leaders and media, that communist ideology, backed by the Soviet Union, would expand relentlessly, toppling governments and bringing more countries into the Soviet sphere of influence. This fear was not entirely unfounded, as communist movements did gain traction in various parts of the world, sometimes with Soviet support appealing to those suffering from poverty and inequality. In response to this perceived threat, the United States adopted a foreign policy strategy known as containment. The goal was to prevent the further spread of communism beyond the countries where it already held sway. The CIA became a crucial instrument in this global containment strategy. While diplomats engaged in public negotiations and the military prepared for potential conflicts, the CIA was often tasked with the hidden side of this struggle, It worked in the shadows, using covert means to counter Soviet influence, support anti-communist forces, and ensure that strategically important countries remained aligned with the West, even if it meant subverting their existing governments. In the early 1950s, Iran was a nation stirring with democratic aspirations and a desire for national sovereignty. Its prime minister, Mohammad Mossadegh, was a charismatic and widely popular leader. He had been democratically elected and was a strong nationalist. One of Mossadegh's primary goals was to gain control over Iran's vast oil reserves, which had been exploited for decades by the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company, a British-owned corporation. Iranians saw little benefit from this arrangement, with most of the profits flowing out of the country. Mossadegh believed Iran's oil belonged to Iranians. In 1951, Mossadegh's government nationalized the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company, meaning it took control of the oil industry. This move was celebrated by many Iranians as a step towards economic independence. However, Great Britain was furious. It lost its most valuable foreign asset and imposed a crippling embargo on Iranian oil, severely damaging Iran's economy. The British government, led by Winston Churchill, sought help from the United States to undermine Mossadegh and reverse the nationalization. Initially, President Truman's administration was hesitant to interfere so directly with a popular nationalist leader. However, the American perspective shifted when Dwight D. Eisenhower became president in 1953. The Cold War was intensifying, and fears of communist expansion were paramount. British officials, along with some American policymakers, began to paint Mossadegh as either a communist himself or as dangerously naive and likely to lead Iran into the Soviet sphere of influence. They argued that if Iran fell, its oil wealth could benefit the Soviets, and its strategic location could be lost to the West. This argument, emphasizing the communist threat, eventually convinced Eisenhower and his Secretary of State, John Foster Dulles, that action was necessary. The CIA was then tasked with orchestrating a coup to remove Mossadegh from power. This secret mission was codenamed Operation Ajax. It was not a military invasion by American soldiers. Instead, it relied on a carefully orchestrated campaign of propaganda, bribery, and political manipulation. CIA agents led by Kermit Roosevelt Jr., a grandson of President Theodore Roosevelt, worked from within the U.S. Embassy in Tehran. They used millions of dollars to bribe politicians, military officers, newspaper editors, and even street gang leaders to create an atmosphere of chaos and turn public opinion against Mossadegh, paving the way for his downfall. Just a year after the Iranian coup, the CIA turned its attention to Latin America, specifically Guatemala. In the early 1950s, Guatemala was led by President Jacobo Arbenz Guzman. Like Mossadegh in Iran, Arbenz was a democratically elected leader who sought to implement reforms for his country. His main policy was an ambitious land reform program. At the time, a tiny percentage of the population owned most of the fertile land in Guatemala, while the vast majority of rural peasants, many of them indigenous Mayans, lived in extreme poverty with no land of their own. Arbenz aimed to change this. A significant portion of Guatemala's best land, particularly banana plantations, was owned by the United Fruit Company, a powerful American corporation. UFCO, later known as Chiquita Brands International, had enormous influence in Guatemala and other Central American countries, often referred to as banana republics. Arbenz's agrarian reform law aimed to expropriate large, uncultivated landholdings, including significant portions of UFCO's unused land, and redistribute it to landless peasants. The government offered compensation based on the company's own declared tax value of the land, which was very low. The United Fruit Company was deeply alarmed by Arbenz's reforms. The company had powerful allies within the U.S. government, including Secretary of State John Foster Dulles and his brother CIA Director Allen Dulles, both of whom had past legal connections to UFCO. The company launched an extensive public relations campaign in the United States, portraying Arbenz as a communist threat. They argued that his land reforms were inspired by Moscow and that Guatemala was on the verge of becoming a Soviet satellite in America's backyard. This narrative effectively tapped into the prevailing Cold War anxieties. Convinced by these arguments and genuinely concerned about any perceived communist inroads in the Western Hemisphere, the Eisenhower administration authorized the CIA to remove Arbenz. The operation was codenamed PBS Success. Much like Operation Ajax in Iran, it was not a direct U.S. military intervention. Instead, the CIA planned to use a combination of psychological warfare, propaganda, economic pressure, and the organization of a small US-backed mercenary force led by a Guatemalan exile, Colonel Carlos Castillo Armas. The goal was to destabilize the Arbenz government and install a leader more favorable to US interests and UFCO. The Central Intelligence Agency developed a sophisticated toolkit for changing governments without resorting to open warfare, relying instead on covert methods that were harder to trace directly back to Washington. One of the most fundamental tools was espionage, utilizing a network of spies and informants. These agents on the ground, both American operatives and recruited local assets, gathered crucial intelligence about the political landscape, identified potential allies and adversaries, and assessed the vulnerabilities of the target government. They were the eyes and ears that informed the entire operation, providing the groundwork for subsequent actions. Money, often delivered in suitcases filled with cash, was another indispensable weapon in the CIA's arsenal. These secret funds, sometimes referred to as black budget money, were used for a variety of purposes. They could bribe influential politicians to switch allegiances, pay military officers to support a coup, or fund opposition political parties and labor unions that could challenge the existing regime. Money was also used to hire crowds for staged protests, creating an illusion of widespread popular discontent, or to pay journalists and broadcasters to disseminate specific narratives favorable to US objectives. Propaganda played an absolutely critical role in these covert regime change operations. The CIA became adept at psychological warfare, manipulating information to shape public opinion both within the target country and internationally. This involved planting stories, sometimes true but often exaggerated or entirely false, in local newspapers and radio stations. For example, the CIA might spread rumors about the corruption of the target leader, fabricate evidence of communist infiltration, or create an atmosphere of fear and instability. The aim was to demoralize supporters of the government and galvanize opposition. Finally, the CIA often worked to identify and groom alternative leaders who would be more amenable to American interests. This meant finding disaffected military figures, ambitious politicians, or exiled opponents who were willing to take power, often with promises of US support and recognition once the existing government was overthrown. The agency would then provide these chosen successors with funding, strategic advice, and sometimes even weapons or training for their supporters. The idea was to have a replacement government ready to step in once the old one was sufficiently weakened or toppled by the orchestrated crisis. The most frequently stated and widely understood reason for American covert interventions during the Cold War was the overarching goal of combating the global spread of communism. US policymakers genuinely feared that the Soviet Union was actively working to expand its influence and that any country adopting communist or even strongly leftist policies could become a pawn for Moscow. This domino theory suggested that if one nation fell to communism, neighboring countries would inevitably follow. So, stopping communism anywhere, by any means necessary, was often framed as a vital defense of the free world and American security. Beyond the ideological struggle against communism, powerful US economic interests often played a significant, sometimes decisive role in the decision to intervene. American corporations had substantial investments in many foreign countries, particularly in resource extraction like oil, minerals, or agricultural products such as bananas. When foreign governments moved to nationalize these industries, implement land reforms, or enact policies that threaten corporate profits, these companies would lobby the US government intensely for action. Protecting American business interests abroad was thus a key, though often less publicly emphasized, motive for intervention. Geopolitical strategy and the pursuit of national interest, broadly defined, also drove these secret operations. The United States aimed to cultivate and maintain a global network of friendly, allied governments. Countries that were strategically located, possessed valuable resources, or bordered the Soviet bloc were of particular importance. Ensuring that these nations had stable, pro-American regimes was seen as essential for projecting US power, securing access to military bases or listening posts, and maintaining what American leaders considered a favorable balance of power in various regions around the world. Ultimately, the United States hoped to achieve several outcomes through these covert coups. The immediate goal was usually the replacement of a problematic leader or government with one that was more compliant and aligned with US objectives. In the longer term, the hope was to create stable political environments that would be resistant to communist influence, open to American economic investment, and supportive of U.S. foreign policy initiatives. The aim was to shape the world in a way that benefited America, ensuring its continued dominance as a global superpower in the face of the Soviet challenge, even if the methods used were morally ambiguous and subverted democratic processes. In Iran, the CIA's Operation Ajax successfully removed Prime Minister Mohammad Mossadegh from power in August of 1953. He was arrested, tried, and placed under house arrest for the rest of his life. The Shah, Mohammad Reza Pahlavi, who had briefly fled the country during the turmoil, was quickly reinstated as the absolute monarch. With Mossadegh and his nationalist movement crushed, the Shah consolidated his power, effectively ending Iran's brief experiment with democratic governance. The United States had achieved its immediate objective. A friendly leader was back on the throne, and the perceived threat of communism was averted. For the next quarter-century, the Shah ruled Iran as a staunch ally of the United States. He received vast amounts of American military and economic aid. He embarked on an ambitious modernization program known as the White Revolution, which included land reform, literacy campaigns, and expanded rights for women. However, his rule also became increasingly autocratic and repressive. He relied heavily on his brutal secret police force, SAVAK, which was notorious for torturing and imprisoning political dissidents. Any opposition to his regime was ruthlessly suppressed, and genuine political participation was non-existent. Many Iranians, however, never forgave the United States for its role in the 1953 coup. They viewed the Shah as an illegitimate ruler, a puppet installed and maintained by foreign powers, primarily America. The memory of Mossadegh, the democratically elected leader who dared to stand up for Iranian sovereignty, became a powerful symbol of lost independence and thwarted national aspirations. This deep-seated resentment simmered beneath the surface of Iranian society for years, fueling a growing opposition movement that drew support from diverse groups, including secular intellectuals, students, and religious conservatives. This simmering anger and widespread discontent eventually boiled over into the Iranian Revolution of 1979. The revolution, led by the exiled Ayatollah Ruhollah Khomeini, toppled the Shah and brought an end to centuries of monarchy in Iran. An Islamic republic was established, characterized by its deep hostility towards the United States, which it famously dubbed the Great Satan. The 1953 coup, intended as a quick fix to a perceived Cold War problem, thus had profound and unforeseen long-term consequences, fundamentally reshaping Iran's political trajectory and leading to decades of animosity between Iran and the United States. Following the CIA-orchestrated coup in Guatemala in 1954, President Jacobo Arbenz Guzman was forced into exile. The US-backed Colonel Carlos Castillo Armas promptly took power. One of his first acts was to reverse Arbenz's landmark agrarian reform law, Decree 900. The land that had been expropriated from large landowners, including the United Fruit Company, was returned to its previous owners. The hopes of hundreds of thousands of landless peasants for a piece of land to call their own were extinguished. The coup effectively ended Guatemala's 10 years of spring, a period of democratic reform and social progress. The overthrow of Arbenz ushered in a dark era for Guatemala. Castillo Armas himself was assassinated in 1957, but his ousting of Arbenz set a precedent for military rule and political instability that would plague the country for decades. A succession of right-wing military dictators, often supported by the United States, governed Guatemala. These regimes systematically repressed dissent, targeting students, labor leaders, intellectuals, and indigenous communities who were perceived as sympathetic to leftist ideas or who simply advocated for basic human rights and social justice. Democracy was effectively dismantled. This repression fueled a brutal civil war that lasted for 36 years, from 1960 to 1996. The conflict pitted government forces against various leftist guerrilla groups. The Guatemalan military, often with U.S. training and support, committed widespread atrocities including massacres, forced disappearances, and acts of genocide against the indigenous Mayan population. A United Nations-backed Truth Commission later found that state forces and related paramilitary groups were responsible for over 90% of the human rights violations, which resulted in the deaths or disappearances of an estimated 200,000 people, predominantly civilians. The 1954 coup had a devastating and lasting impact on Guatemalan society. While the United Fruit Company regained its lands and U.S. strategic interests were seemingly secured in the short term, The intervention fostered deep-seated poverty, inequality, and a culture of violence that continues to affect the country. It also created a legacy of profound distrust and resentment towards the United States throughout Latin America, where the Guatemalan coup became a stark example of U.S. interventionism. The success of Operation PB Success came at an immense human cost for the Guatemalan people. When considering whether these secret coups orchestrated by the CIA were good or bad, the answer often depends on the perspective. From the viewpoint of American policymakers during the Cold War, these operations often appeared as short-term successes. Governments perceived as unfriendly or potentially aligned with the Soviet Union were removed from power. Leaders more favorable to U.S. interests were installed. American economic assets like those of the United Fruit Company or oil companies were protected. In the context of the intense global struggle against communism, these actions were often justified as necessary to safeguard national security. However, for the people living in countries like Iran and Guatemala, the consequences of these interventions were frequently tragic and far-reaching. The overthrow of democratically elected or popular nationalist leaders often led to the installation of authoritarian regimes. These new governments, propped up by U.S. support, frequently engaged in severe repression of their own populations, curtailed political freedoms, and dismantled social reforms. Instead of fostering stability, these coups often sowed the seeds for prolonged periods of violence, civil unrest, and deep societal divisions, leaving scars that would endure for generations. One of the most significant lessons from these covert operations is that interfering in the internal affairs of other nations, even with the intention of achieving specific strategic goals, can have profound and often unintended negative consequences. The blowback from such actions can be severe. In Iran, the resentment over the 1953 coup directly contributed to the 1979 revolution and the rise of an anti-American Islamic Republic. In Guatemala, the 1954 coup fueled decades of brutal civil war. These long-term outcomes often undermine the very interests the U.S. initially sought to protect, creating new enemies and fostering lasting anti-American sentiment. Understanding this complex history is crucial. It reminds us that actions taken in secret can have very public and enduring results. It highlights the tension between a nation's pursuit of its perceived security interests and the right of other nations to self-determination. The stories of Iran in 1953 and Guatemala in 1954 serve as cautionary tales about the limits of power and the importance of considering the long-term human and political costs of foreign intervention. Learning these lessons helps us better comprehend the current global landscape and the complex legacy of America's role in shaping it.